Hi everyone. This week's slides are split into two parts, A and B, and it follows along with the two parts of your reading assignment this week. No silly hat. I'm spending a couple of days at my partner's place, so I didn't bring my hats with me, sorry. So let's jump right into it. Our first main topic is the Indian Act, and you'll be reading the kind of little prelude of a few pages called "The Indian Act" in Robert and Bob Joseph's book. Sorry, and the first chapter. And it sounds like a lot, but if you've already looked at the book, it's a small book, and the pages are it doesn't take long. Plus, the way that I set up the reading questions is that you don't need to necessarily sit and read it cover to cover. It kind of guides you through certain sections of it. So, and hopefully these slides will help understand, if you're having trouble with the reading itself, hopefully this will clarify a few things. So what is the Indian Act anyway? We've mentioned it a few times this semester, and those of you who are also taking Allison Jones' course, I think she's already talked about the Indian Act a little bit. So essentially, it's a collection of federal regulations or laws, and these regulations legislate pretty much everything about the lives of First Nations people. Under the Indian Act, First Nations people are called Indians, still to this day. Remember, this does not include Inuit and Métis people, all right? So common misconception. So it was originally created in 1876, and if you look at the PowerPoint, obviously you can't link through it from the video, but when you're looking at the slides, which you can download from Leia, you can click here, and it takes you to a document that actually has the text of the original Indian Act. And this wasn't long after Canada actually became a country, which was in 1876. So that said, there are direct links with the Constitution Act, which was, allowed Canada to be a country of its own in 1876, which was this Constitution Act was originally known as the British North American Act, or BNA. So what this did, is that within the Constitution Act, or the BNA, there are these regulations that gave the federal government, this new federal government that was being created, jurisdictions over Indians and the land reserved for Indians. And sometimes I'm quoting Joseph directly. Joseph is his last name, right? So I'm using APA here, just little hints to get used to this for your final paper where you're going to have to do this kind of citation. So it's saying essentially this new settler government has rights over people who were here before settlers came and their ancestral lands. So that's pretty huge, obviously. And I find it interesting. So at the beginning of this little chapter called the Indian Act, which is that first chunk you're going to be reading for this week's reading assignment, Bob Joseph talks about how there was the BNA, in giving Canada this jurisdiction, put Canada in a conflict of interest. Now, if you've never heard the term conflict of interest, it's not a good thing. We hear it sometimes if somebody's given a position of decision-making capacity and they're in a conflict of interest, it means that they can be biased in their decision-making because they have the power to make decisions that will benefit them. They're not a neutral party. So, for example, if you follow the news, last year there was the whole scandal with the We charity and stuff like that, and they were saying that Trudeau and one of the ministers were in a conflict of interest there because they granted this charity certain privileges, certain rights to run, something that would be sensibly a good thing in terms of giving youth opportunities and stuff like that. But they could have chosen a bunch of charities, but they chose the one that they had personal ties to. That's a conflict of interest. So in this case, the conflict of interest emerged because Canada was given responsibility for Indians and lands reserved for Indians, but they're also responsible for negotiating treaties on behalf of the Crown, or, the British government, to which Canada was still, even though it was a new country, was still kind of accountable to the British Crown. So when we say the Crown, that's what we're talking about, right? Essentially the Queen of England. So So on one hand, you're saying, I'm responsible for managing this group of people and their ancestral lands, but I'm also responsible for trying to get more of it from them through treaties, which we know from previous weeks have been heavily problematic. So it's giving them it gave them ultimate control over the well-being of First Nations people. And it's on paper, and it's all legit according to European-based federal law at this point. And this is an important junction, by the way, because students understandably get confused because we're talking about stuff that happened way before our lifetimes, right? And so sometimes we hear these terms, colonizers, settlers, and so on, and it gets confusing. And sometimes students will write papers where they're talking about things that happened before Confederation of Canada and mixing them up with things that happened after Confederation. And it's important to distinguish between them because anything that happened before Canada was a nation was being done by European powers that weren't actually physically here. They were acting through settlers and explorers and traders that were here, people that they sent over. But those powers were still in England and in France. Okay? Once Constitution happened, Confederation, creation of Canada in 1867, it becomes the government here that is acting. Okay? So it's important to kind of keep that in mind. Depending on what you're going to wind up researching, you want to be very careful about when in time you're talking about to figure out which words you're using. So if you're talking about something that the British and the French powers did versus something that Canada itself did, it's significant to make that distinction. So at this point, anything onwards from here, we are talking about the federal government and, in some cases, provincial governments. So what were the goals of the Indian Act? Well, they want to keep First Nation, and First Nations is a newer term, but I'm using it out of respect. Whenever we use Indian, we're referring to things that they were saying through the Indian Act, or that the language the government was using. But when I'm talking about people from our current perspective, I'll use First Nations, but we're talking about the same group of people here. So they wanted to keep them, the government wanted to keep them under tutelage. So basically, we're controlling you. Also, the goal, they didn't come out and necessarily say it in this word, but they wanted to assimilate them. The word they would use was civilize, right? Because again, the thinking at the time was that the ways in which First Nations and other indigenous people lived, that was uncivilized. It wasn't according to European-based standards of living. Right? So they saw them as primitive, needing, the mighty white man to come in and elevate them by civilizing them. They also, and Bob Joseph points this out on page 8, they also wanted to get rid of the Indian problem. Because obviously, First Nations and other indigenous peoples being there, living their life according to their ancestral values, using the land in the ways that made sense in their cultures, that was a problem for the colonial powers before Canada existed, and then Canada itself, which wanted to expand, right? So the federal government wanted to acquire more land for settlers, right, to expand Canada as a nation, and that meant having access to more land, more waters, more resources, or things that they considered to be resources. So the Indian Act was directly linked to that, and we'll see that in more detail later on. Now, the Indian Act still exists, but it changed over time. There were amendments. So there were some amendments before 1951, but 1951 were some of the major ones, because at this point in time, some non-First Nations and some non-Indigenous people were starting to kind of get more knowledge about what was going on, especially during World War II, and information about residential schools were coming out, and people were starting to go, hey, that's not cool, right? And so obviously First Nations people were aware of what was happening, but other Canadians were not. And so in 1951, there were some amendments to the Indian Act to make it seem less harsh. And you can look at pages 11 and 12 for some of those changes that happened. So some restrictions were removed. And then in 1985, there were more amendments, and we'll learn more about that later this semester. But it's still in effect, the Indian Act itself. And if you click here when you download the original slides, you'll be taken to the current version of the Indian Act. And what we can see is that despite all these amendments that kind of removed some restrictions over time, the Indian Act still gives the federal government of Canada control over First Nations lives and identities. There is no other cultural or ethnic group that is under tutelage in this specific way, where the government actually gets to legislate your identity. Different groups face different kinds of discrimination, for sure, and that's historic. So other racialized people in particular face systemic discrimination. But to actually have a law that legislates people's identities is a whole other dimension of it. So let's, in that first section on the Indian Act itself, Bob Joseph talks a little bit about what Indian status means. And this is common misconception, because sometimes when people start hearing the term Indian status, they think that it's something special. There are white people in Canada who want to get rid of the Indian Act, not because they think it's racist against First Nations people, but they think it's racist against white people because they think that Indian status gives people special privileges. Now, we can read up later on. Maybe some of you will want to do this for your final project if you want to learn more. And there are some things that are phrased as benefits for people who have status. So in their on reserves, they don't pay taxes. This doesn't apply outside the reserve, right? That's a common thing. Oh, they don't pay taxes. They get free education, free this, free that. What people don't understand often when they think this is something special, like some kind of gift from Canada to First Nations people, is that actually these things often they're part of prior treaty agreements. So access to land in exchange for some of these so-called benefits. Also, these benefits do not come close to making up for what has been stolen and lost, right? So it's like if somebody beats you up and steals $100 from you, and then they say, okay, I'll give you $20 back so you can go pick up some milk or whatever. That's not a benefit. You still got stolen from. So it's not, and it's also important to remember that it's not something that First Nations people themselves created, all right? So it's the federal government that made this up, and it doesn't go along with First Nations ideas of what makes a person a part of a culture. So to the federal government, it's based on genetics, or you'll hear the term blood quantum, right? And how much Indian blood do you have? And that's not something that was ever a part of First Nations cultures for the most part, right? We know there are a bunch of different First Nations cultures, but most of them, it was more about like who you are as a person and what teachings you've grown up with, and to what extent you uphold your responsibilities as a member of your society. All right, so it's and people from other nations could get adopted. Some of the more warrior-based cultures, if they kind of took somebody in war, that person would then get adopted into the culture. So different ideas about what makes a person a part of a culture. Now, in the original 1876 version, who was considered a person with Indian status was men, first of all. Like, it was very male-based. Again, this comes from the federal government of quote-unquote Indian blood who belonged to a specific band. And we'll learn more about bands shortly. And it's another Indian Act creation. So it's kind of a system of governance that was imposed by the Indian Act. So these men, their kids, and their wives would be considered to have Indian status. So we'll talk about this more later as well, but a white woman, for example, who married a man with Indian status was actually granted status, but a First Nations woman who married a non-status man would lose her status, and so would her kids, and we'll learn more about that. So that's how they defined Indians. And what's really important to know, and we'll talk. Actually, I'm skipping ahead here. So back to the main topic. 1951, when there was one of those major amendments, they changed the definition of what an Indian was. Right. So they made it much more vague, and you can see more about that on page 11. So other terms just from that first little section, you can look at pages 11 and 12 just to see, and this is might be useful because he's revisiting some of the terms we also always already learned earlier on in the semester. So it's good to kind of see how he explains them. They're a bit of variation, but mostly it's the same. And he does specify here, and this is kind of useful to know, that the term First Nations originated in the 1970s as a replacement specifically for Indian bands. All right, again, Indian bands come from the Indian Act. They're not a First Nations creation because they had different systems of governance before that. And so the term can either refer to one band, many bands, or even people. So you'll go to a place sometimes, like where I used to live, the community of Chisasibi, spelled Chisasibi, they refer to themselves as the First Nation of Chisasibi, but all the nations, all the communities in that area are also considered a First Nation within Iuisi, and individuals themselves can sometimes refer to themselves as First Nations. And I also want to point out, he also talks about why he uses the word Indian, and Chelsea Vowell, by the way, does this too, and she does have a chapter devoted to this topic as well, more specifically status and how it works today after the 1985 amendment. And so they'll use Indian because they're referring to things in the Indian Act. Okay, this doesn't mean that non-Indigenous people are free to use the term to refer to people. So just please don't ever do that. Say a person, oh, that person's an Indian, or Indian people say this. When we're using the word here, it's because this is the word that the federal government was using, and we're talking about the legislation in particular. Okay, so that nuance is important as we move along here. So you'll see the word in my slides, you'll hear me say it, but it's because we're referring to the legislation. When I use First Nations, it's because I'm talking about the people in a more general sense, and it's a more respectful way to refer to people. Okay, so chapter 1, so the first section was called the Indian Act, and it's a short section that gives the background we just covered. But then the next thing you're going to read is the first chapter, which goes over 4 of those original regulations that existed at the very beginning of the Indian Act. So we'll go over those here to help clarify some things, or more actually to summarize what he talks about and to help guide you through the material. So the band council system, we've mentioned it before. It's still in effect today, even though it was created way back in 1876. And really, it was an overt attempt to replace traditional governance systems, because these traditional governance systems were seen as barriers to the goals of the federal government, which was to expand and get more land for settlers. And it mostly worked, unfortunately. There are still people in many communities today trying to maintain and bring back traditional governance systems. So you'll hear of people maintaining longhouse traditions locally in Ganawage and Ganazadage, and Ganyankehaga nation, these Ganyankehaga nations. If you followed what was happening last year just before the pandemic with the Wet'suwet'en on the West Coast, a lot of it had to do with these tensions between people who kind of adhere to the band council system and people who say, no, that's not our system, we're using our traditional governance. So it's based on an election system, so just like the federal system, and that sounds more to a lot of people. A lot of non-Indigenous people say, well, what's wrong with the election system? Isn't that the most fair system ever? And we could develop on that in other discussions, but for many First Nations people, they feel that their traditional systems were actually more fair because they had they have always lived in smaller communities. So to elect a person to be in charge in a similar way to Westerners is actually seen as unfair and undemocratic, because their traditional systems, sometimes they were what they would call hereditary. Other times it was more casual than that, and we've learned a little bit already about the clan system of the Haudenosaunee. But it's in leadership in these contexts, leaders were answerable directly to their community members because they lived with them. They were surrounded by them every day. So they weren't off in some office somewhere making decisions for the people. It was really in constant consultation, and if people didn't like what you were doing, you were answerable to them, and it was much more consultative and consensus based. So the election system actually, compared to those other systems, is seen as an unfair system by a lot of people because it gives power to some individuals over other people. Now, the elected chiefs, which are First Nations people, they're in charge of administering the Indian Act, which actually doesn't come from their communities. And who they're answerable to, they're not answerable to their own people. They're answerable to the Federal Department of Indian Affairs. And you can see on page 18 a list of their actual powers. It's not much. They can't do much because they always have to answer back to the Department of Indian Affairs, which is obviously not First Nations people. It's part of the federal government. So it's kind of like the federal government came in to communities where people had their own systems, where people were accountable to each other, this collectivist way of life, where everybody was helping each other out, or were supposed to anyways, and said, okay, you have to, every 2 years, you have to elect one person who's in charge, but we're telling this person what to do. So it's a way of controlling, right? So, wow, I'm having trouble here advancing through my slides. So the band council system created a bunch of disruptions, so that we just kind of alluded to here. So, for example, until amendments to the Indian Act in 1951, only men in these communities could actually vote in the band council elections. So we're seeing an imposition of patriarchy here. They started with a 1-year election cycle and eventually moved to a 2-year election cycle, which is very short. So every 2 years you have a turnover of the band council, and so you never have people there long enough to actually help the community move along and collaborate on longer term projects to help the community in any significant way. It's already hard because, again, your hands are tied by the federal government, but then anybody who did want to do something to kind of actually try to maneuver out from under that system, they were blocked because they were kicked out after 2 years. So that's disruptive in and of itself. And then you have divisiveness in communities, because then what comes with the election system is this individualistic thinking where people want they embark in this quest for individual power. And this is disruptive to more traditional collectivist worldviews because, again, we're not talking about large groups of people that most of us have grown up in here, right? We're talking about smaller communities, maybe just a few hundred people, maybe a few thousand. So it's very disruptive to an ancestral worldview where people were looking out for each other in these small communities. So very disruptive. So the other regulation that Bob Joseph talks about in this chapter is the denial of status for some First Nations women. So this took effect until 1985, and again, eventually we'll talk about the 1985 amendment, which didn't fix the problem, but changed how it looked. So how the Indian Act worked until 1985 is that a First Nations or quote-unquote Indian woman who married a non-status man would lose her status. So even if she married a man who had been born First Nations, if he had lost his status, and we'll talk later about how loss of status would work, she would lose her status too. If she married an Inuit man, Inuit were not subject to the Indian Act, she would lose her status. She married a white man or a black man who didn't have status, she would lose her status. And so would her kids. Her kids would never have status because she didn't. The reverse is not true. A First Nations or status Indian man who married a non-status woman would not lose his status. His wife would actually gain status, right? But that didn't happen as much as the reverse. So it was in the interest of the federal government to do this because it undermined traditional roles of women who, in many nations, as we've already started to learn with the Haudenosaunee cultures and other First Nations cultures, women had central roles, and so to remove status from a lot of First Nations women is a tool of assimilation because you're talking about large chunks of people who would not ever have status. This is what happened in my family, right? So for the last 3 or 4 generations, nobody has had status because at some point there's a woman who married a white man French-Canadian man, and she lost her status. So none of her descendants could get it. And yeah, there were amendments in 1985 that meant that people who had lost it through this could regain it. But it's a lot of paperwork, and you need years and years of research to prove your claim. So, for example, people like my mother never bothered doing this because you're trying to survive and raise your kids. Who has time to do all this bureaucracy? So, then often as a result, and he doesn't go into this here, but this is an interesting research project for those of you interested. If they lost their status, often they were forced to leave their reserve because only status Indians could stay in their reserve according to the Indian Act. So they would be alienated from their own families and communities, right? So it has very long-term effects on First Nations women, and you can make links with discrimination, poverty, loss of culture, and many other things. Those of you who wind up doing more research, for example, on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls will see that there are connections to this over the long term. So again, in 1985 and again in 2010, there were amendments, but they didn't fix the problem because so much damage has been done at this point. Now, the third thing that Bob Joseph talks about in this chapter is the creation of reserves. Now, here's a common misconception. Again, a lot of non-Indigenous, mostly non-Indigenous people will assume that reserves are this special gift. Look, they were given these pieces of land, and it's a gift of extra land that they didn't have before. And that's not the case. It's not a gift at all. So on paper, it makes it look like that, right? Because on paper, it's a tract of land set aside under the Indian Act and treaty agreements for the exclusive use of an Indian band, right? As Bob Joseph explains it on page 24. So that sounds like a special privilege, and it's one of those things that makes some white people think, oh, look, they're getting all this special treatment. They have their own reserves, right? But actually, in practice, despite how it looks on paper, it's actually a system of apartheid. There are some scholars who have documented that, like if you've ever heard of apartheid in South Africa, that they were inspired by the reserve system. So it was a way of confining people. It was a way of controlling the movements of First Nations people defined as Indians, in order to give access to settlers to more lands and resources, and opening up lands for settler farming. So it was not a gift at all to these communities. In fact, it was restricting their movements, because before this, and before those tricky treaties that we've already talked about, people had unlimited access to very, very large tracts of lands that were ancestral to them and on which they could live as they saw fit and had their adapted ways of life through, hunting, fishing. Further south, you did have some agriculture, So this was actually a restriction, not a gift. So they make it sound like a gift with the wording that they use. But just like with the treaties, it's a scam. So the federal goals at the time, so again, we're talking about the initial creation of Canada as a country, and as we know, back at the time, Canada didn't have the same borders that it does today, so they were wanting to open it up. They were wanting to bring more European settlers to Canada, right, to populate it with Europeans, people of European descent, especially British, French to a certain extent. They wanted to build a railway from Ottawa to the West Coast to facilitate that settlement. So all these Indigenous communities who were, still living their traditional ways of life, they were in the way of this grand goal that Canada had. So sometimes, you hear John A. Macdonald and some people are saying, okay, yeah, he was racist, but he did some great things. He helped create Canada. But the very way in which he did that was based on greed and stealing from First Nations and other Indigenous people and racism. Okay? So it's not that grand a thing. I'm not telling you not to be proud of Canada, but I mean, the way it was created was extremely sketchy, and some people would say illegitimate. So reserves were a solution to what the federal government saw as a problem, the so-called Indian problem that we talked about before. So by confining First Nations people to a small portion of their ancestral lands, then they could grab a lot of those lands, which they had already started to do with those, treaties. Sometimes the portions of land used for reserves were actually not even on people's ancestral lands. So if these were lands that the federal government was like, oh, this would be great for farming, and we're just going to move them somewhere far from their actual ancestral lands. And this is actually really devastating because the first half of the semester we've kept coming back and back to this idea of the central role of the relationship between people and the land, and that the land to First Nations and other indigenous people are not just this material thing that you can exploit and use. It's something that's alive, something with which you have a deep spiritual and emotional and physical bond, something that you take care of and that takes care of you, right? In the same way that you take care of each other as people and as other living things. So to remove people from those ancestral lands or to restrict them to just one small part of it cuts that link, which is absolutely fundamental to everything else about First Nations and other indigenous cultures. Inuit people are not subject to the Indian Act, but similar things happened with settlements, and at some point this semester we'll have the opportunity to learn more about that. Along with reserves, there was a imposition of single-family housing, which was a European model, and First Nations people didn't, centralize nuclear families in the way that Europeans did at the time. And these houses were owned by the federal government. So again, all these things that add up to disruption in traditional ways of living and mess with value systems as well. Now, linked with all this, and the fourth and last regulation that Bob Joseph talks about concerning the Indian Act is the concept of enfranchisement. And this is another word that is incredibly misleading because it sounds great, right? Enfranchisement is supposed to be the opposite of disenfranchisement. It's like supposed to be a gift, but what it actually is a loss of status rights and restrictions. And in a way that has mixed connotations, because if we think about how Indian status was something that was imposed by the federal government, and that comes with a bunch of restrictions and small little rights that don't make up for the restrictions and the losses, well, then to not be considered an Indian subject to this act anymore sounds like a good thing. But unfortunately, those little bit of benefits that it has also get taken away. And from the government's point of view, enfranchisement meant the granting of Canadian citizenship. You got to become a person. Because here's the thing. Under the Indian Act, until 1951, a person was defined as anyone who is not an Indian. So First Nations people, quote-unquote Indians, were not considered people. This is in the law. And if you think I sound really pissed off right now, it's because this never fails to piss me off, okay? Until 1951, which was not that long ago. It's 20 years before I was born, more or less. Within my parents' lifetime, some people were not considered persons under the law. And so enfranchisement was a way to give them the gift of personhood through Canadian citizenship. You become civilized, you get the right to vote at the federal level, because again, up until 1951, people with Indian status didn't have the right to vote in federal elections. So now, do you think this actually means they had access to all the rights that settler Canadians had? Think about it. Think of the racial discrimination we still see in society today, and that gives you a clue right there. Okay, because you can give people full citizenship, it doesn't mean they won't be subject to racist discrimination. So in the beginning, enfranchisement was voluntary because from the ethnocentric view of the federal government, it's like, well, it goes without saying that they're going to want this. Why would they want to remain Indians with, all these restrictions? And so they said that any Indian, First Nations man over 21 who was considered sober, because again, there was a stereotype that still exists today that First Nations people and all Indigenous people are they're drunks, right? Big stereotype there. And industrious, so hardworking, because again, their ethnocentric views made them think that First Nations and other Indigenous people were not hardworking. So any of these men over 21 who were considered sober and industrious could apply for enfranchisement. They'd be assessed, and if they were judged to be fit for enfranchisement, they would be given a portion of their reserve. So in addition to getting Canadian citizens, they would take a chunk of the reserve to give it to these individuals. And after a couple of years, these individuals would receive title deed. So that's breaking up the reserves. And you can see more details on page 28 for that. But again, it's another sneaky backdoor way to, first, they restrict people to these reserves, as we just mentioned, and then they're chipping away at it by enfranchising people and then taking pieces out of the reserve to promote individual ownership, which was never a First Nations concept. Okay, so that's another disruption. And so there was this part of the Indian Act here that, you know, Bob Joseph refers to as the Gradual Civilization Act, which was this kind of plot to enfranchise as many people as possible and remove more people, remove status from more people. But they were surprised, like not as many people applied as they thought. They thought people would be jumping all over this, but hardly anybody did. And bands actually spoke out against it and resisted it through different means that you can read about in the book. So eventually, so in 1880, they made more amendments. Starting 1880, there were different periods of time when they come up with amendments to actually make enfranchisement compulsory. So, for example, in 1880, anybody who wanted Indian or First Nations person who got a university degree or who became clergy would be automatically enfranchised. In 1920, they had more amendments, so they would have these examination boards, again, all non-First Nations people, who would pick people out and judge them to see whether they were fit to be enfranchised. And again, according to Canadian, European, Euro-Canadian standards. And even if the person didn't want it, they would become enfranchised if that examination board judged that they should be. Again, we talked about this earlier. So women marrying non-status men would automatically become enfranchised. Later on in the year isn't specified, but joining the military. So he gives the example of some people who fought in World War II for Canada. They went off to the war, and when they came back, they found out they had been stripped of their status and could not go back to their reserves to live, for example. So there are long-term effects of this. This chapter covers 4 regulations. The book covers 21. There are many, many, many more. Right, like he was saying in I think in his intro, to cover them all would be a much, much thicker book and nobody would read it. So he covers 21. We just talked about 4, the 4 in his first chapter. But all of these things together over the long term severely undermined First Nations cultural systems and values, which we talked about before, right? Because we had cultures where there wasn't this concept of owning land. There's a relationship of reciprocity between people and other living things and the land. Women were considered, central to these cultures, and all of that was undermined. Patriarchy and individualism were promoted. Ties to ancestral lands were removed at the psychological and emotional level, at the spiritual level. We'll talk eventually about other regulations that actually banned ceremonial activities, for example, and those physical ties. People wouldn't be allowed to leave their reserve, so they couldn't go fish and go hunt and things like that on their ancestral lands anymore. So, then they were stuck dealing with the Canadian system of like buying their food at the store, but they wouldn't necessarily have the income to do that because of the Indian Act. So it's a giant mess, and it still has effects today despite amendments that have been made. So that's it for this topic. Again, you'll learn more detail by looking over the book, and the assignment will help you kind of think this through. And some of us will get together next Wednesday and talk about this in more detail. If you have any questions about any of this, as usual, you know where to reach me. By Mayo.